This is the Dollemore Daily.
Hi, I'm Mike Greiner from the Democratic Activist Channel. I'm just sitting in for Jesse while he moves from California to D.C. to better cover what's going on there. But the news never stops, and so here we are talking about redistricting. Now, that might not sound like an exciting topic, but let's put it this way. You might think that the next congressional election isn't going to occur until next November, but as it turns out, as a result of redistricting, the Republicans likely have already won the House of Representatives. It turns out that now 2/3 of the districts across the country are complete. And as a result of the Republican control of state legislators across the country, even if everything stays the same, Republicans will win control of the House. Because, of course, they're only 5 votes away from gaining a majority there. If they succeed in this effort, this will, of course, stand in the way of Joe Biden being able to accomplish much of his agenda, even if the Democrats retain the Senate, which is certainly possible. The Senate, of course, since it's based upon state lines, is not as easy to gerrymander as the House is. Now, in some states, like North Carolina, I think that people are hoping for some type of judicial intervention to try to address this outrageous gerrymandering that's going on. But given the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court essentially said that it was no longer going to enforce the Voting Rights Act, well, I'd say that such intervention is unlikely. The only chance we have, frankly, is for Congress to pass something. Let's talk about this gerrymandering. Here's an example for you. In North Carolina, which was won by Trump with 1.35% of the vote, the new map that's been approved by the legislature gives Republicans at least 10 of 14 congressional districts. In Ohio, once seen as one of the key swing states, Trump won it by only 8%. Despite that, the new map gives Republicans 13 of 15 congressional seats. And in Texas, which has long been perceived as a state that might ultimately turn blue, where Trump won only by 5.58% of the vote, the new map gives Republicans 25 of 38 seats, or 66% of the congressional seats. How is this possible? Well, the idea of gerrymandering goes back to a former governor of Massachusetts, who ultimately ended up as vice president of the United States. He was one of the founding fathers. His name was Eldridge Gerry. And Gerry led a redistricting process that led to the drawing of a state legislative district that looked an awful lot like a salamander. Gerry's political opponents attacked it, saying that it was an example of a gerrymander. And despite the fact that it mispronounces Gerry's last name, the name stuck. Well, there are 2 approaches that parties take to trying to gerrymander. One is what's called cracking, and that's what we see in North Carolina right now. And by the way, I'll post a link to an article that displays how these maps are being generated down below. And what cracking does is it basically takes certain types of voters and divides them up into multiple other districts in which the other party has enough voters to essentially overwhelm the voters who, if they were kept together, would end up controlling that district. So as an example, what we see in the area of Greensboro and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a Democratic area, is that the Democratic votes, if they were packed into one district, which they were in the past, would result in a Democratic district. However, those Democrats who are consolidated within the urban area have been split apart into congressional districts dominated by voters in the rural areas surrounding Greensboro and Winston-Salem. The result being that instead of one Democratic congressional district and 3 Republican districts, we end up with 4 Republican districts. That's an example of cracking. Another approach is what's called packing, where essentially what parties will do is take all the voters of one demographic group, say black voters, and put them into 1 or 2 congressional districts. So, for example, we see that here in my home state, in Michigan, where most of the black voters are basically pushed into 1 or 2 congressional districts. The result is that you have a couple congressional districts that are overwhelmingly Democratic, 80 or 90% Democratic. And it's surrounded by other Republican congressional districts, which have, say, 55, 60% Republican representation, resulting in a number of Republican districts, but only 1 or 2 Democratic districts. Now, as Democrats, we can't be too fast to cast aspersions about this. I mean, we do it too. And in fact, right now, Democrats in Illinois are engaging in their own gerrymander. Although I would argue it's nothing as egregious as what we're seeing in Ohio or North Carolina. The problem is that we Democrats actually favor good government. And so what we've done is in a number of the states where we might actually be able to influence redistricting, we've handed off that power to an independent commission. A commission which, although it's not entirely without some type of political interference, is certainly going to deliver a much fairer map than the kind of map that would be generated by the elected officials themselves drawing the districts. So, for example, here in my home state of Michigan, an independent commission has drawn up a map, and this map has been praised by experts as being one that actually is going to give both parties a fair chance to compete. That'll be quite a change here in Michigan, where Republicans have dominated the legislature, despite the fact that the majority of voters across the state have voted Democratic for a number of years now. All 6 statewide offices in Michigan, all 6 of them are held by Democrats right now. And yet Republicans control both houses of the legislature with large majorities because of their redistricting efforts. That could all change as a result of this redistricting commission. Ironically, because of the fact that it's taken the black votes from Detroit and divided it up more, so now it's spread more evenly in some different districts, so that you now have more districts that are competitive, it's resulted in few overwhelmingly black districts like we currently have. And as a result, the irony is some Democrats from Detroit are actually suing to stop this map from going into effect, despite the fact that really it is fairer for both parties. In another example, in Colorado, you have a state where Democrats actually could have picked up a seat as a result of redistricting, where Democrats control both houses of the legislature and the governor's office, and they certainly would be well positioned to grab that seat. But again, as a result of a Democratic initiative, redistricting has been handed off to an independent commission who has delivered a very fair map, one that does not give preference to the Democrats. And finally, in Virginia, another state controlled by Democrats, at least up until the last election, an independent commission has delivered a map that is, again, fairer to both parties and actually hurts some of the Democratic incumbents who, believe me, if they were in charge of redistricting, they would have made sure to protect. So in many respects, Democrats have kind of tied our hands behind our backs as we've allowed Republicans to run roughshod over us in the redistricting process. Now, you might say this is a good thing because ultimately more fairness is better than none. The problem is, though, that only one party in America believes in democracy anymore. We're going to find ourselves in a situation where Republicans could well find themselves in control of the House of Representatives despite winning a minority of the vote, much as happens in many state legislatures across the country right now, including in my home state of Michigan and in Wisconsin. Republicans have made it clear that they are not above using their ill-gotten power to essentially keep themselves in power despite what the voters say. The only hope we as a country have is that Democrats will essentially have a little bit of courage and pass some voting rights legislation that will protect us from this type of egregious redistricting. If such legislation isn't passed, well, I fear that democracy is really going to be a thing of the past here in the United States. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could check out my channel, Democratic Activist, I'll link to it down below as well. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.